And this is a dense subject and an important subject. In many ways, some of the dangers that lurk under Bill C5 are precisely because a lot of the rhetoric that has wrapped around it has been facile and seductive. The reality is difficult and granular, which is and the antidote to that is people willing to pause and think deeply about what this means for us as Canadians and for nature. As Rochelle said, Stephen will be speaking about some of the tangible major projects that are being proposed and may be coming forward. I'll speak just broadly about what Bill C5 is, what it's meant to do, what it's actually going to do, and what our anxieties are about what happens next. The important thing that I should point out is that although we refer to it as Bill C5, it's no longer a bill, it's an act. It was passed in June of last year. So the Building Canada Act is part of the law of the land. As a result, we don't have the option of trying to oppose or shape the legislation itself, but we do have the option of trying to shape how the legislation is applied and how the government plans to make use of it. In the longer term, I think it will be important for the nature and environmental movement to look at the question of, can this new act be amended? But in the immediate term, it's how can we blunt the worst excesses of this bill in its implementation, and how can we steer it to the extent possible in positive directions? In broadest terms, the purpose of the Act, as the name suggests, the Building Canada Act, is to make it easier for nation-building projects to be implemented across the country. That's always a desirable objective at any moment in time. It's an especially desirable objective now when we are in a tariff war with the United States, and our ability to come out of this as a stronger nation, and indeed as a sovereign nation, depends on our ability to sustain our own economy and to build our own infrastructure rapidly in the face of a rapidly evolving trade war. But as I think we all know, there can be a tension between doing things quickly and doing things well. And if this bill had been about removing unnecessary or counterproductive hurdles to environmental assessments and the approvals process for major projects, I don't think any rational person would disagree with that. The potential tragedy here is that the bill is purchasing speed at the expense of quality. That is to say, rather than getting rid of unnecessary steps, it seems to be trying to get rid of necessary steps. Instead of trying to streamline the democratic process, it is trying to sidestep the democratic process. And instead of trusting Canadians and our representatives to be able to exercise wisdom in offering our opinions on what actually constitutes the national interest, this bill takes that away from Parliament, from Canadians, and it attempts to put it, and does put it, in the hands of Cabinet. So broadly speaking, I would say that some of our anxieties are that the bill or the act weakens environmental reviews. It truncates the process. It creates presumptive approvals, and it moves a lot of this out of the hands of dispassionate regulators into the hands of Cabinet. And indeed, Cabinet has gained the authority to exempt certain projects from federal environmental laws, such as the Species at Risk Act and the Migratory Birds Convention. I think most of us on this conversation would say that the problem with those bills is that they are not strong enough, not that they are too strong. And indeed, I've yet to meet a person who has said that those bills are too strong, too forceful. Getting rid of them altogether, therefore, is not so much a way of streamlining the process. It's a way of allowing potential projects to damage biodiversity in our country in order to maximize profits. The second is that the bills are meant to fast-track projects of national interest, but there's no real definition of what the national interest is. And it is fair to say that everyone who sees an opportunity to make profit in Canada, even at the expense of nature and at the expense of Canadians, will wrap his project in the false flag of patriotism and say that because I'm making money, this is in the national interest. Critically, that money doesn't even need to stay in Canada. It can be used to fund The Act makes no distinction between economic benefits that accrue to Canadians, to Canadian communities, to Canadian corporations on the one hand, and to foreign corporations on the other. And it is no coincidence that some of the most enthusiastic interest that has been shown in projects since the Building Canada Act has been passed have been by American hedge funds and by Chinese government-backed corporations. There's also the question of Indigenous consultations. The Act does tip its hat to Indigenous consultations. However, it talks about consultation rather than approval. For all the governments talk about about UNDRIP and about free and prior consultations, the Act itself requires the government to seek the views of Indigenous people, but it says nothing about respecting the views of Indigenous people. They have an opportunity to speak, but there's no obligation that the government listen to them. And finally, there's the issue of the impact on biodiversity. For all the controversy that has existed in some parts of Canadian society around climate change, there has been a very strong consensus around biodiversity, that it is a public good when biodiversity is protected and extended, that there is a public loss when biodiversity is reduced. This bill almost certainly will undermine biodiversity in our country and frames it as a trade-off between prosperity and biodiversity and nature. In the long term, I think that all of us would argue that a prosperous economy can only be built on environmental responsibility. Sometimes this bill reminds me of the old Warner Brother cartoons where you have one of the characters sitting on the branch of a tree and is sawing off the branch that he's sitting on. That is in effect what this bill or this Act promises. So I'll end up by the question of, so what are we doing about it? Nature Canada, as I said, we are not in a position to be able to say that we are going to stop the Act because it is passed, or that we are going to amend the Act because it is passed. Though amendments are something that we are thinking about in the long term. A lot of the way this Act, the powers of this Act will be implemented will be at cabinet discretion, at the discretion of political actors. And they will be able to make good decisions to the extent that they are influenced by the democratic will of Canadians. They will make bad decisions to the extent that those decisions happen under the cover of night and shielded from public scrutiny. It's therefore vital that for all of us, when there are projects that are being proposed under the powers of this Act to subvert nature and environmental standards, that we organize as Canadians and as communities to make it clear to the government that if they approve damage to our communities, this will not happen without us knowing, and that they will pay a price for doing so. The second aspect is that the Government of Canada does not operate in a vacuum. It operates within a web of international law, and in particular, international trade agreements. While part of the justification of this Act is to diversify away from the United States, that necessarily means diversifying towards some of our other trading partners. And while the Prime Minister is out signing, as he should be, a large number of trade agreements with other states, even those agreements that are being signed today will take years to spin up, to be fully flashed out in terms of national legislation in the respective countries, and to be implemented. As a result, trade diversification for Canada will rely, in the short term, heavily on the full implementation of existing trade agreements, and in particular with the Canada-European Union trade agreement. Nature Canada has therefore been working fiercely with our partners in the European Union on Chapter 24 of the Canada-EU Free Trade Agreement. Again, I'm afraid that these things are tedious, but in the briefest of terms, the Chapter 24 of the Canada-EU Trade Agreement is meant to prevent any of the parties to the trade agreement from trying to gain a competitive advantage over the other by undermining nature and environmental standards. We are, to the extent we can, going to try to use that chapter to inhibit the Government of Canada from sweeping away nature protections on the grounds that it will violate the trade agreement and cause the companies that are trying to exploit Canadian nature to lose access to the European Union market. The law is on our side in this one, and treaty agreements are on our side. But I would have to say that the economic anxiety being felt in Canada is also being felt in the European Union. It's going to require a lot of hard work on our part, but we are applying it. The final aspect, I would say, is the question of what does it mean to build Canada? No matter how this act is used, I think we should all feel a great deal of democratic anxiety by the fact that the government feels that the only way to progress is to set aside democracy, to set aside the role of Parliament, and significantly to set aside the role of public institutions and of Canadian citizens. There is still the possibility of a bad law being used for good purposes, and that is to say, being used to implement projects of national interest that don't damage nature, but instead protect nature and reinforce nature. Instead of, for example, using the powers of the Act to sweep aside environmental protections to make it cheaper and faster to build oil pipelines across our country and pipelines through vulnerable areas. This Act could be used to accelerate the electrification of our country, the strengthening of the electricity grid, and projects that are founded on renewable energy. Part of our effort, therefore, is identifying genuine projects of national interest rather than projects of large private interest, projects that will not just build jobs in Canada, but also strengthen nature in the long term. And then to take these projects to the Government of Canada and say, if you're really serious about building our country, these are the kinds of projects that you need to get behind. This isn't going to be an easy process for all of us. One of the challenges that we have faced is that in the first year of his tenure as Prime Minister, Mark Carney has held a very large number of publicly declared meetings with lobbyists from the oil and gas industry and lobbyists from the extractive industries. To the best of my knowledge, he has held no declared meetings with representatives of nature organizations and environmental organizations. And if you're only listening to one group, then your decisions are likely to be shaped by that one group. The role of Nature Canada and of the people on this call and of Canadians at large is to ensure that it will be impossible for Carney and this government not to hear the voice of nature. Because although the people who want to use the Act for destructive purposes are wealthy and are powerful, they are in a minority. There are far more of us than there are of them. And we can certainly succeed in having our voices triumph, but only if we speak out together. That's all.
Thank you very much, Akash. And we'll go over now to Stephen Hazel. Just one moment while I share the presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming to this webinar. What my objective today is really to provide some background on what's happening, on the juggernaut that is coming at us, but to provide a bit of information to folks across the country on what you can do with respect to any major projects that are in your vicinity. So if I could have the next slide. So what can we do? Akash has given us some of the background relating to C5. This idea of fast tracking of development is just, it's happening big time. The dismantling of environmental laws, and most recently we've got this discussion paper from a few days ago which proposes more dismantling of environmental laws. And thirdly, the one that perhaps gets talked about the least are the huge amounts, $280 billion of subsidies that the federal government is putting aside to support industry with respect to these major projects. That's $280 billion over 5 years. So in terms of the outline, I just want a quick reflection on what just happened, what's happened over the past year, because Carney is really following Trump's approach of flooding the zone. So there's so much going on, it's hard to sort it out. But I do want to talk about major projects and give you a quick summary of all the ones that are coming, that are being proposed. A quick discussion on environmental law dismantling, a bit on the initiative for one project review, summarizing the various subsidies, a little bit of talk about threats to nature that may catch on with the public, and then finally just some discussion about you in your organization, in your region. What should you be thinking about in order to get organized so that you can do what you can to defend nature in the face of these major projects that are coming at you. Next slide, please. So what just happened? My take on it is that the industry narrative that regulation is holding back Canada's economy has become conventional wisdom, and everybody believes it. Everybody talks about it, and it's only partly true. Part of the reason why the economy is not doing well is because we have a lot of really stupid major projects. We always have had, and it's going to get worse going into the future. So yes, regulation has been an issue, and the government's right to try and streamline that. But at least as important is trying to get good projects proposed. And that, unfortunately, that's not happening. If we look, when I show you the list of the 21 major projects and strategies that are being proposed, there are only a few that I would say are actually going to help in terms of reversing biodiversity loss and reducing GHG emissions. And the government has really almost virtually abandoned sustainability, impact assessment, public participation as part of its vocabulary. And the climate and biodiversity crises are being really swept under the rug. And one argument that lots of people make is that, well, we trust that the Prime Minister Carney will get back to that. But right now he's got to deal with, the rascals to the south, and let's give him some slack. Well, I think that honeymoon period should perhaps end. Next slide. So I'm not going to run through all of these, but these are the projects that have been referred so far to the Major Projects Office, which was established under Bill C-5. There are now over 200 people working in this office, and their main job is to expedite these projects. And in a minute, I'll show you how much money is being devoted to that. Some of these projects are already underway or are well into the impact assessment process, like the Contrecoeur terminal in Montreal. That's construction has started. The Darlington project, one small modular reactor has been started of the 4 that are planned. So a number of them are already underway. So why they need more help from the Major Projects Office is not at all clear to me. Some of these other projects are just ideas at the moment, but they're all basically, not all, many of them are already in receipt of hundreds of millions of dollars in federal funding to get them underway. Examples of those like the Alto high-speed rail, the Mackenzie Highway, the Grays Bay Road and Port, those have already got significant federal funds. So those are the projects. Next slide. In addition, there are what they call transformative strategies, and I think they call them strategies because there isn't actually a clear proponent for them as yet. Some of them will be familiar to, I think, all of you, like the Pathways Plus, this is the carbon capture and storage project. And those folks, the oil sands folks, they're looking for tens of billions of dollars in subsidies to do this carbon capture and storage, which will yield, even if it works, very modest results in terms of reducing GHG emissions. Another one, the critical mineral strategy is another one. There's a $1.5 billion to promote development of critical minerals. The Port of Churchill, that's the, developing Churchill, Manitoba as a port, and rebuilding the rail line from the Pa, hundreds of kilometers through Muskeg. And then one of the good projects, hopefully, is this Wind West Atlantic Energy, which it would bring offshore wind power to other provinces in the east. So those are the 21 projects / strategies that are currently on the table. There are many more that are being proposed through to the Major Projects Office. So at this point, I just wanted to stop for a second and ask. I think in the chat I can see where some of you are coming from and what projects are in your neighborhood which are of concern. But maybe if you want to, just to help all of us, if you could just in the chat just indicate, what project you're concerned with. Like what's the one that maybe brought you to this webinar. I mean, there's a lot of folks in Southern Ontario, so this Alto high-speed rail. There's one comment there, Alto. I know there are folks from the Lower Mainland who are concerned about Roberts Bank and the possible expansion of the TMX pipeline, which would mean more oil tankers going through the perilous waters of the Salish Sea. But anyway, as we go along, you could if you just put some in the chat, and then at the end of the workshop, I wanted to talk about ways that we could follow up, that Nature Canada could follow up, or that I could help personally in terms of getting folks organized, because I think one of the real critical aspects of this is that there will be an onslaught of projects, and the time frames are going to be tight, and the government is really not interested in what people think unless we really make them want to care what we think. Next slide, please. So in terms of dismantling environmental laws, Akash has talked about Bill C5, the Building Canada Act, and what the law does is it designates these national interest projects, and by so doing, it allows cabinet to exempt them from various federal environmental laws. Interesting, this was rush to get this bill passed this time last year. Not a single project has yet been designated under that law. So you got to ask, what in heaven's name was the big rush? Why did we have to rush this thing through when you really haven't used it, other than setting up the Major Projects Office? The other thing that is being proposed is that the federal reviews and approvals of these major projects will be guaranteed within 2 years. Now, there's a little mistake in my presentation here. This guarantee is not a legal guarantee under the Act. This was guaranteed under the Speech from the Throne, but they do propose to put a legal guarantee in place under new legislation that we're just learning about, that's outlined in this Getting Major Projects Built discussion paper. So this discussion paper has got a number of aspects to it, which are mainly not very good. The one point is they've been proposed to legislate a 1 year period for federal review and decision making, and there will be another year that would be set aside for proponents to get their paperwork organized after the notice of commencement of the project. There's going to be no more independent impact assessment for nukes or pipelines. The Canadian Energy Regulator is going to have complete responsibility for regulating pipelines. The Impact Assessment Agency is out of the picture, and with respect to nukes, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission is going to have all the authority. One really, really worrisome proposal for legislation are these so-called federal economic zones, which I think, you got to say that it looks a lot like what Ontario had proposed under its Bill 5. So you would basically have these pipeline corridors or transit highway corridors that the government could make law free. They could deem, once the economic zone is established, they could deem that federal laws don't apply in those zones. So finally, there's a number of regulatory and legislative changes that are proposed with respect to the Fisheries Act, the Species at Risk Act, etc. And one of them, I think, attract attention, well, for folks who care about species at risk, is that they want to change the provision with respect to what's called jeopardy, so that they want to ensure that projects that may jeopardize the continued existence of a species at risk can go forward regardless. And apparently this is targeted specifically at the southern resident orca population, southern resident killer whale, sorry. And with the growth of oil tanker traffic through the Salish Sea, and that population is very much at risk, as I think folks in BC know, perhaps folks elsewhere. We could lose that altogether, and that's envisaged by this legislative change set out in the Dustin paper. So I'm not going to talk about provincial laws, but folks across the country will know that provinces are doing the same sort of stuff in terms of dismantling environmental laws in Ontario, British Columbia, Nova Scotia, other provinces. So we've got this overall trend of dismantling of environmental laws, which, those laws are there for a reason, and they're there for a reason, and perhaps we can trust Wall Street and Bay Street and the big oil companies to do right by nature and climate, but I wouldn't put any money on that. Next slide, please. One of Carney's initiatives since being elected was to ensure that for any given project there was only one review. And it is true that in recent years, since the Harper legislation of 2012, it has got more confusing. But the result of this one project, one review is that we're going to have many projects with no reviews. First ministers agreed just about a year ago that they would work together towards effectively implementing this one project, one review process to ensure a single assessment for all projects. And since then, they've signed cooperation agreements with most provinces. But the upshot of these cooperation agreements is that Canada, the federal government, is backing out of assessing major projects and basically letting the provinces decide what should be assessed and how it should be assessed, with no with no overarching standards that apply to what provinces do. Now, with respect to federal interests, I mean, for example, with respect to fisheries or migratory birds, um, the provinces get to decide whether or not their impact assessment meets federal requirements. The federal government doesn't even get to decide, like the Fisheries and Oceans doesn't even get that the provincial assessments are adequately protecting fish habitat. The province gets to decide. So, I mean, it's just utterly astonishing that they would give up that authority. So, one project review is the federal government has basically given up with respect to assessing major projects, with the exception of projects on federal lands and with respect to some projects in Atlantic Canada where the provinces don't have the resources to do their own thing. Next slide, please. I want to just mention that if the federal political support for all of these major projects wasn't enough, they're pouring in just astronomical amounts of money by way of subsidies. And by the way, Canada has an international agreement to phase out subsidies to the oil and gas industry, as well as under the global biodiversity framework to phase out subsidies harmful to biodiversity. But in the spring economic statement, the government makes the claim that they're putting $280 billion over 5 years into infrastructure. You've heard about this Canada Strong Fund, this $25 billion fund, sovereign wealth fund. But there's a whole bunch of other ones, like the Canada Infrastructure Bank has got $18 million, and they've got money in the Grays Bay Road and Port in Nunavut. There's a number of others that I won't go over. Well, the critical minerals one is another one, 1.5 billion for critical minerals mines, some of which produce radioactive waste such as thorium and uranium. So there's a lot of money going into this proposed, and this is all how this funding works will all be orchestrated through the Major Projects Office. It seems to me that's mainly what they're doing, is setting up the funding for these various projects so that they can steamroller through. I mean, the one caveat to all of this, and which the nature community, I know it's created a challenge for us, is that Carney did announce this force of nature strategy at the end of March, 3.8 billion over 5 years, which is likely going to do a lot of good for nature. So on the one hand, you've got $280 billion to industry, and then on the other hand, well, you've got maybe 3.8 billion for nature. So, and there's other money for climate stuff as well. But anyway, you get a sense of the amount of money that's being poured into this by the federal government. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go over the what are the threats to nature and climate from all these various major projects. You folks out in your regions, you will understand them much better than I will. But I think that the point is that as this juggernaut rolls over us, we've got to in each region with each project, we've got to figure out what are the issues that are really going to capture the most public attention that we can get some traction on. For example, a colleague of mine lived in Churchill, Manitoba for a number of years, and she's now in Winnipeg. And we were talking about this Port of Churchill project, and she said, well, there's thousands of beluga whale who use the estuary of the Churchill River. Thousands. I didn't know that. But you want to rebuild the port there and rebuild the rail line? What are the impacts going to be on on beluga, let alone the polar bear who live in the Churchill area. So there are a number of issues, and you folks know them better than I do. One set of issues that the government just seems to completely oblivious to is how much carbon storage is going to be lost as we dig up the boreal forest for all these northern roads, the rail line, the port facilities, etc. Let alone the direct GHG emissions from these projects. And then the loss of opportunities for protect areas as well. What impact is anyway? So my point on this is that we've got to figure out what the what the key issues are going to be with respect to these projects, and we've got to start doing it soon as they come at us. Some of the projects will come at us more quickly than others, but there's lots of money. There's lots of federal money being spent already on these projects. So we have to mobilize to get caught up. Next slide, please. So what are we going to do? What can we do? We got to try and get organized early on, and it's folks out in the nature network. You're gonna have to figure out how to get organized, and who you're gonna work with. I think it's pretty clear that for most of these major projects, and reaching out to Indigenous nations is going to be critical, because they will have legal tools that we won't have access, that non-Indigenous folks won't have access to. There's not going to be very much time for research and advocacy, so we've got to get on with that right away. And one point that that Akash has made, and that I think is very important, is that we focus on project economics. I mean, my sense of Carney is that nature has no value unless it can be monetized or monetarized. What's the right word? So, well, let's figure that out, because I think many of these major projects, so-called, will be white elephants. They will not produce net benefits for Canada. They'll generate profits for the investment banks and for oil companies, whatever, but the rest of us can suck eggs, as they say. So that's something to think about at an individual regional level, but perhaps more generally, we need an initiative to get after these major project economics, especially given the billions that are being poured into them by the federal government. The other thing is, talk to lawyers about litigation down the road. I mean, most of the time it will be too early to file your application for judicial review, but start thinking about it now. I would suggest that might be a strategy in some cases. And then finally, what can we do in terms of direct action, in terms of demonstrations? I mean, I personally think, I think Carney he doesn't really care what the environmental community says. He's got an idea about what he thinks is right. I don't think he's going to start paying attention until he looks out his window at Langevin Block and sees a lot of angry people yelling up at him. So I think getting on with direct action is I think is a key. And just speaking for somebody who's worked in Ottawa for a long time, over the past 10 years or so, we got very comfortable working with the Trudeau Liberals because we shared a lot of their values, and they were good people to work with by and large. I don't get the same sense with Carney's people. So we have to get back to organizing, I think, and organizing direct action that politicians will see. And it's not just Carney, it's all members of parliament and senators and civil servants as well. So I think I'm just about done here. So just one more slide, I think. So Nature Canada, Ecovision, that's me. We're committed to helping whomever defend nature from major projects. So if I can be of any help, I'm always available to chat on the phone and give you the benefit of whatever wisdom I have. As a next step, I mean, assuming that this is useful, a next step might be to organize sectoral or regional webinars that focus on specific regions. Like if it looks like we're talking about another pipeline to the west coast of BC, maybe we need to maybe another webinar needs to be organized that focuses on some of the opportunities there, or it could be some of the work in the north. I mean, a lot of these projects are talking about new port facilities, roads to the Arctic. Maybe a webinar focused on that might be an idea. Anyway, I think we're open to suggestions from folks in the Nature Network as to how we could best help in this way. So I will stop there and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And I will put our contact information in the chat just for anyone who wants to contact Stephen or myself at Nature Canada. So we will open up the Q&A, and I have a few questions that I've received already. If you have any further questions, please put them in the Q&A box, and we will answer as many as we can. So first question that I received is, could the federal economic zones, which were proposed in a discussion paper last week, these would basically allow cabinet to pre-approve major industrial projects and exempt them from impact assessment and other environmental laws and regulations. Could those be even worse than C5?
Totally.
Yeah, I could say we had a meeting with the political advisors to the Minister of the Environment yesterday. One of the questions we asked was, would it be possible for the cabinet to designate the entire country as a special economic zone, and therefore there would be no environmental standards applicable anywhere? And the answer is, there's nothing so far to suggest that they could not do that. A lot of this legislation is premised on what is not a very sophisticated political philosophy, which is trust me, bro, that the government wants to accumulate vast amounts of power to itself, and Canadians should trust that they won't misuse them. It's a terrible idea. Legislation that relies on the charity and wisdom of an individual is just bad legislation. And one way we have found effective in persuading that to government, that is to say Liberal MPs, is to ask them, would you trust Pierre Poilievre with the powers that you are granting to Mark Carney? And every single one of them has said no. It's been an easy argument to say, you realize that you're not going to be in power forever, that eventually there will be a prime minister in whom you do not have confidence, who will wield these untrammeled powers that you are granting yourselves. And that should not give them pause. That is exactly the kind of thing they should be thinking about when they are deciding whether they are going to support legislation or not. But it is clearly not the kind of question they've been asking themselves. So yes, these special economic zones, even as they stand, would be terrible, because they create a presumption of an approval even before there's any review. And secondly, there is, at least in the discussion paper, no limit to how large a special economic zone could be. The only advice the minister's office offered us was, you should probably raise this in your comments to the discussion paper.
Can I make two quick comments? One is, we don't know what's in the legislation. It may be coming very soon, even before the House rises in June. So we'll know better then, and there may be some clarity there that limits what the government can do with these special economic zones. But the question is really important, and it was a point that I didn't touch on. Akash did just a bit now, is that when you have these special economic zones, it allows the government to pre-approve projects. So it would allow them to pre-approve a pipeline through a corridor prior to any environmental impact statement or analysis being done. So this is really putting the cart before the horse, it seems to me. But that is really a very, very important aspect of the discussion paper, and what the discussion paper might what the bill might have in it.
Thank you. I'll read you two questions that both relate to the relationship between provincial and federal politics on this front. One is a concern about, in Ontario, could Ford designate areas or parts of the provincial parks as special economic zones? And then someone else is commenting, with all the awful changes also in Ontario for environmental legislation, how do those changes compare between what is being done federally and what is being done provincially? And can we fight back in the same way as we're trying to do in Ontario?
Well, I think I have reviewed Bill 5, the Ontario Infrastructure Act, or what do they call it, Protecting Ontario's Economy Act. And yes, you can have special economic zones through provincial parks, not through federal parks. Which we don't have that many of in Ontario, and they're not very big. But but the answer is yes to that question. And I think that, I mean, you could see the Ontario and the federal government getting together and have overlapping special economic zones, such that there are no federal or provincial or municipal laws that apply to whatever the project is, whether it's a pipeline or a new superhighway or whatever.
All right, I have another question here from Deborah saying, so Prime Minister Carney spent Earth Day at EarthPath in Ottawa. Would it make sense to focus on ecotourism and education funding when talking to his government, and also focus on key biodiversity areas, such as just been done by Birds Canada at Long Point?
I mean, I think one of the best things that could, I mean, all those are good ideas. I'm not sure. Mark Carney is a guy I've only met with. I've only met the guy a couple of times. One was at a Green Budget Coalition meeting when this was even before he was governor of the Bank of Canada. He was associate deputy minister of finance, and we were talking to him about how to green the budget, and he was getting up and wandering around and taking phone calls. He was just clearly bored with all of us. So I'm thinking the ways to get to him are to speak to him as if you were talking to your banker. What's the monetary value of what you're talking? What's the economics of what you're talking about? This other stuff, I'm not sure that cares about. But another idea is to get the guy out into nature sometime. I mean, I know he grew up in Fort Smith, and there's lots of nature around there, but maybe somebody should try taking him on a canoe trip or something. I mean, the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society years ago used to take prominent politicians on these canoe trips. I think it was, I've forgotten what we called it at the time. But I mean, David Suzuki was on one, and there were different federal ministers that were involved. Get him out into the wilderness so that he can see that nature actually does have value beyond its economic value.
I think In addition to that, there's another aspect. My sense from Carney is that he is he's also falling victim to politicians' logical fallacy. That is to say, we're at a moment where we must do something. This is something, therefore we must do it. And he is he has grabbed hold of this. So the result is, if we say to him, for example, a pipeline is a terrible idea because it's bad for nature, it's uneconomic, it's just metaphorically piping money to a Texas-based a holding company. His response, his instinctive response will be, I have to do something, and this pipeline is something. So part of our argument has to be not just don't do X, but you should do Y. We need to try to identify projects, and for yourselves, if you can find projects in your community that you think would genuinely build up our country, would be good for nature and good for employment, good for all of us. The argument I'd encourage you to make is to say, do this other thing instead. This will be a genuine project of national interest, as opposed to what you're hearing from people who can afford to hire lobbyists for hundreds of thousands of dollars.
I have one last question about the need for direct action. Could you expand a bit about the parts of these policy and legislative changes that are being proposed that will limit the public's opportunity to participate in consultations?
Sure. Well, the Federal Impact Assessment Act basically requires meaningful public participation in all of the assessments that are done for projects that are subject to the act. There are virtually no projects that are going to be subject to that legislation anymore. So all of those opportunities for the public to get involved and to speak directly about what the impacts are, to research the impacts, make presentations to people who can synthesize and report back to the government on what those impacts are and how they can be addressed. Public participation is, and then so far what we've seen, like another example, these cooperation agreements between the government of Canada and the provincial governments on who's going to do what in terms of impact assessment. Yes, there was an opportunity for public participation, but the government basically released the final version of these cooperation agreements a day or two after the consultation period ended. So it didn't matter what we were saying. They were going to do what they were going to do at the beginning, and the rest of us can go hang. And I'm a bit worried with respect to this upcoming legislation based on this discussion paper that was released last week. I mean, if the government is really anticipating introducing the bill in this session, I mean, the 30-day consultation period ends on June the 7th, which, as Akash mentioned, is not nearly enough time to provide thoughtful commentary. I mean, if that's the plan, well then very few of the comments coming from the public on the discussion paper are going to make their way into the bill. In fact, we've heard that the bill's already been written. The so-called drafting instructions have already been written, so that this discussion paper may just be lipstick on a chicken, as they say.
All right. Thank you so much for your time, Stephen and Akash, and thank you everyone who is participating for joining us today. As Stephen mentioned earlier, this has been hopefully a first in a series of webinars. And we have kept notes about all the projects you have mentioned. Our hope is, if it is useful to you, to start doing regional webinars based on specific major projects or areas where major projects are happening. I saw Citizen Mine, for example, in New Brunswick be mentioned a bunch of times. So if you think it would be useful for us to bring together nature organizations around a specific major project and work together, please let us know. I've put our contact information in the chat, and we will be very happy to set that up. We will share slides as well if you would like access to those, or if you need the recording for anyone else in your office, happy to share that as well. And thank you so much for joining us, and have a wonderful day.
And thank you, Roshan, for organizing this. Although Stephen and I did all the blabbing at the microphone, Roshan did all the work to make this possible. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rochelle. Thanks, everyone.
Have a nice day. Bye.